And could you just talk a little bit about, like when you were at college or throughout your career, like the sort of landscape, like the landscape of like women in these fields, like how it was then and maybe how it's like changed over time and like
Right.
how you see it today?
In terms of, again, I know a little history. Fortunately, I do not go back too far in history, but again, as we know, there have always been women, outstanding women. Everybody knows the name Marie Curie, and she won, I think, 2 Nobel Prizes. And there have been women throughout history who are iconic for their accomplishments and sometimes in the face of great adversity. I think when I was in college, which was the late 1960s, early 1970s, it was a very social movement time, but the women's movement as such in the U.S. really happened in the 70s, the organized form of it. But in science, I did see very quickly as I moved from college and went out with my goal of being a science writer, and I ended up going to Washington, D.C. first thing and getting a couple of different jobs. And I did see women in science being more marginalized, having to really make themselves visible and get themselves into leadership roles. And just the numbers alone really, and they have improved in some fields, and even today in 2018 we still have a number of fields such as engineering or physics where the numbers of women in those fields are still much lower. On the other hand, even when I was in college, I started writing about women, young women doctors, and that was still kind of an accomplishment. And I remember maybe in the 90s when a few of the medical schools actually reached 50% of the students being women. Women did better in biology. There were more women in those fields, but in the so-called hard sciences, they were much less female-friendly. And I guess one other thing that concerned me then and concerns everybody now is the so-called pipeline. So how are you going to get women into these fields? And so there was concern and recognition of that, and one of the ideas was, again, how do you encourage women to get into science? And a lot of it has to start very early. The transition in middle school where young girls are pushed away from science, even though they are often the ones doing extremely well in math and science. It's something where they can be discouraged. I think there's been great improvement in that, and a lot of programs to encourage young women to be aware of science, active in science, and supported, again, in a more group effort. I feel like many of the women that I interviewed in the 1970s, they would become the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and they were sort of singular in many cases. They did not want to talk about being a woman scientist. They just said, no, I'm a scientist, I don't want to talk about being a woman in science. And there was that, as there is with anybody who's kind of in a pioneering position, which is, hey, I got here, so, I think other people can get here. But at the same time, there were obviously women starting to gather together, women-friendly groups in science, and more encouragement throughout the 70s and 80s to encourage women to enter the pipeline, both in college, to major with, and then to stay with it. But then, as now, one of the big challenges is you get people into the pipeline, but how far along do they go? And there's still a kind of leaky pipe where young women become discouraged for various reasons and don't keep up that academic as one case. That's not the only kind of woman in science. And my particular concern over the last 5 years, but maybe longer, is how do we get more women leaders in science? It's really not enough to get women into the entry level, but how do they succeed at that entry level? And again, people drop out in the workplace, getting their PhDs. But I'd say, it's been very encouraging, the community and support from women and men in science, and even some of the very tough areas of astronomy and physics, where there have been more women who've been successful, and where they have been very active in encouraging more women, hiring women in their labs. And so it does, I'm not going to use the oft-used takes a village, but I think creating a culture where women are welcome is one of the most important things, and having support to become a leader, because until we have enough leaders in any field, whether it's women or whether it is minorities in science and technology, where you don't have enough, you need support for doing that. And of course, I think the individuals who have the toughest time would be minority women of color in science, because they have even more barriers, and although there's concern about that as well.
Mm-hmm.